Well, I was studying in the Netherlands in Kampen at the Theological University there, and I got the opportunity in 1973 to go as a visiting scholar to Union Theological Seminary in New York, um, where I met James Cone, who was teaching Black liberation theology there at the time. It's also the place where he stayed until his death earlier this year. Uh, but going to the United States was really an amazing transformation experience for me. When I left the Netherlands, I had already sort of agreed with my professor, Gerard Rothuizen, on a topic for my doctoral dissertation. And I was very interested in the whole debate around eschatology and how eschatology could be a driving force for serious theological engagement in political, socio-economic questions. And thinking of the work of G.H. Ter Schecht, who was a famous, very controversial, but wonderfully intellectual person at the time. And so I was going to write on in Reformed theology, we know of three uses of the law, and I was going to write on a fourth use of the law. So, an usus eschatologicus was going to be the title of my dissertation. It was a very exciting, it was a very proper European theological thinking question that I had. And then I went to the United States. And I was introduced to Jim Cone. I began reading the books that he had published. I listened to his lectures. At that same time, I met Gaylord Wilmore, who was then at Rochester School of Theology, who wrote a book on Black radical Christianity, a kind of a historic look at the development of Christianity in the African American community. Those were very influential books. And as persons, they were extraordinary theologians and persons as well. And at the same time, Gustavo Gutierrez, who wrote Liberation Theology down in Peru, at visiting Union Theological Seminary, so I met with him. I studied with Paul Lehman, who was a personal friend of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So he introduced me in a different way to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was also a very studied situation with my professor in Holland. But Paul Lehman was also an exceptional Reformed theologian. Hey, he introduced me to a side of John Calvin that I really never knew. So it was a whole lot of experiences. And then of course, I got immersed in the situation. I traveled through the United States. I went to Black churches. I listened to the way that they preached. I got engaged at the Martin Luther King Peace Center down in Atlanta, Georgia. I met books about Malcolm X, got engaged in those discussions, and in those days, those debates were raging. Just a year before, John Foreman marched into Riverside Church and announced that Black people should be given compensation, reparations for 400 years of slavery, which caused a huge balabaloo. The National Committee of Black Churchmen had taken out a full-page ad in the New York Times talking about black theology and black power and a theological view of black power, strongly under the influence of Jim Cone, of course, and used a sentence that I will never forget. This is a powerlessness creates a race of beggars, and we refuse to beg for our freedom now. So it was amazing stuff. It blew my mind. So by the time I was done with all of that and came back to Holland, I had to do my doctoral exam, which was an examination that determined whether one would be allowed, at the end of their studies, whether one would be allowed to go on and do the doctor's degree proper. And I decided that for my thesis, I would write on a comparative ethics of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, which I did, and I entitled it Coming In Out of the Wilderness. And to my surprise and to my great joy, my professor thought it was such a good study that he decided to publish it in a series that appeared under the imprint of the Theological University itself. So it was a huge honor for me that he did that. And that, of course, became a book that was read worldwide in the end. And it was, I believe, and I say so, I hope you don't think me immodest, but it was the first study of Martin King and Malcolm X together, and looking at their role in the struggles for justice and freedom in the United States, its impact on the situation that I found in the US, and their relevance for the struggles that we as South Africans were engaged in at the time. Now, this was 1974. And that book got published at the end of that year. So in 1976, I got my degree, and that was a bit of a tension in the beginning with my professor, because I had thrown away the eschatological thing, and I said to him, to me, that is too Eurocentric. I want to do something about black theology, and we talked and talked and talked. And he wanted to know whether black theology was not just a fad for the moment, whether it would not just disappear within a year or two, and people would move on to other things. And I said to him, I don't think so. And he then said to me, can you promise me that this book will still be relevant 10 years from now? Well, I couldn't make that promise, of course. But 10 years from that point, and when he was already past, my professor, I was looking at the 4th edition or so of Farewell to Innocence. And so, yes, it had staying power, black theology. Farewell to Innocence became the first transnational conversation between South Africa or Africa and America in terms of black theology as liberation theology. And the conversation between those two situations has captured me ever since. And so my last book had as a subtitle a transnational conversation. And I still today try to see liberation theology as a global thing that would bring together people driven by their faith in struggles for justice all over the world and in different situations. So in that book called Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood Red Waters, I look at the situation in South Africa and in the United States and in Palestine. So for me, that is an ongoing engagement. And that's how I got into black theology. And when I came back, of course, that was 1976. Soweto uprisings had just begun. I came back 2 weeks after that, and was immediately drawn into the whole struggle. I was asked by the students at the University of the Western Cape to come and speak to them about the meaning of black consciousness for that generation, that day in the Western Cape. And I remember very well, University of the Western Cape didn't even have a hall at that time. There was a cafeteria, but the cafeteria was far too small. In the end, we ended up outside on the lawn. I was standing on a table talking to a vast crowd of students, and that was the beginning. From that point on, I was involved not just theologically, but politically. And for me, the question was always not whether my theology and my theological studies could be of use to me as an academic, but whether my theology, what I believe was real, live theology, because it related to the lived experiences of oppressed people in South Africa and elsewhere, whether that theology could be meaningful to ordinary people. I thought about that a lot, and I came to the conclusion that I would not write about a theological concept until I have figured out a way to preach about it. So if you can't preach it, don't write it, became my motto. And so whatever theological struggles I had, I battled with it until I could find a way of saying it in a sermon to ordinary people, and that they could understand and respond and embrace it and take it for themselves as part of their journey of faith. And that's how my theology became a lifelong conversation with people. This book that I just talked about, Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood Red Waters. Now that book, Farewell to Innocence, was written in 1976. Blood Red Waters came out in 2018. And it is largely a result of conversations that I had with students on this campus, Bloemfontein campus here, and with young people in Mangaung, right across the road here, and with young people on two other campuses, about the questions of reconciliation, about the question of resistance, and about the question of the role of people of faith in movements of resistance. And what does it mean when we talk about reconciliation was all the rage from 1995 onwards. And I had very serious questions about reconciliation. So you will find reconciliation in that book. You will find a whole chapter on Ubuntu, where I critically engaged the concept of Ubuntu. What does that mean for us in South Africa? And much of that. Oh, and there's a whole chapter on Paulo Freire, who said that it was the historical obligation of the oppressed to liberate the oppressor. I have read Biko over and over again, and I missed it. But now, in my present reading of Biko, I came across Biko saying that what we need, now this is 1972, what we need is selfless revolutionaries. And a selfless revolutionary, amongst others, is one who is dedicated to the freedom and complete liberation, not just of the oppressed, but of the oppressor. So for some reason, I did not connect Biko with Paulo Freire in that book. So now, Selfless Revolutionaries will probably be the title of the next book, in which I grapple with the theme selfless revolutionarism. But I now have to ask the question, what does that mean after 25 years of democracy and freedom that's not really freedom? So the question of South Africans and our feelings of manufactured contentment with ourselves, manufactured contentment of our reconciliation process, manufactured contentment with our idea of freedom, while everybody screams we are not reconciled really. We're not really free. Liberation cannot be this, not with what is going on today. So those questions can now be put in this present framework. And I am constantly surprised at how absolutely relevant the thought of Biko has become. So that's where I am, but it still is a conversation with people in South Africa and with people elsewhere, because that's going to be a book about a global ethic of resistance, a global ethic of solidarity, and what does that mean. So in that sense, I have continued to try to think with people, be challenged by people in communities. There's a young man who leads an organization of shack dwellers, Abaslali Majolo in Durban, and he says that the task, he was speaking to us theologians, is the task of you theologians is to be inside the struggles that's inside the communities and inside the people. And if you think about that, it's quite a challenge. But that's what we're trying to be. So more liberation theologians, more as organic theologians than as public theologians. Farewell to Innocence was my dissertation, and I asked the question, what is one of the key things that is prominent in our South African reality? And I thought, if we talk about Black consciousness and Black theology and Black power, and my book was certainly the first South African attempt to bring these three concepts consciously together in a systematic analysis of a theological analysis of the situation here. And I thought one of the key problems is this thing of innocence. And I explained that what Black consciousness wanted to do was to strip Black people of our innocence in the situation. And that comes in many forms. We accept the description of our humanity as that had been determined by the white dominant political and social and religious culture. You accept your helplessness as a Black person because the situation is so overwhelming. Apartheid was such a thoroughly evil system. Apartheid was such a thoroughly systematized system of oppression. The Afrikaners really put their Calvinistic orderliness in work in apartheid. And so every area of life was controlled by apartheid in a really frightening way. And that's why we called it a totalitarian system. It was so total in its onslaught on Black people and on oppressed people in general, but also on white people. It did not allow you any room for a thinking that was counter to the dominant reality and to the dominant narrative that came out of the system. And accepting that meant that we accepted with a kind of innocence, oh, there's nothing we can do about it, it's all white people's fault. But Black consciousness was a philosophy that was deeply self-critical. So it was critical of the white power structures and domination, and severely so. But it was also evenly severe on Black people. Biko spoke of the Black person as a sheep that would follow anywhere, as a fear-filled person, as a person who had two personalities. On the one hand, when he is home with his friends, he bragged about how he hated white people, But when he was with white people, he was crawling on his hands and knees and calling the white person everything he was supposed to. Yes, boss, no, boss, donkey boss. It's all of that. And he says, literally, he says, the black person is somebody who is so angry, but he goes into the toilet and he screams out his rage, and he comes out of there, and then he is the same scraping and bowing, subservient person that white people would like him to be. And we should not be innocent of our own complicity in our oppression. And that's what Farewell to Innocence set out to do. And that was the meaning of the combination of black consciousness and black power with black theology. But at the same time, white people grew up with a kind of innocence. White privilege puts you above the realities of the world. You live in a white bubble of privilege and of superiority. You don't have to really worry about the situation of black people. The black people you allow yourself to see are all black people who are subservient, because the black people who would challenge you and who would fight you, you throw in jail, or you ban them, or you kill them. And you grow up in a white world. You go to school. All you hear is the white dominant narrative. You go to church, all you hear, you read your newspapers, you listen to apartheid radio, you watch their television, all you hear is a confirmation of your whiteness and your superiority and the inferiority of black people. And then you hear how happy black people are with the situation in which you have placed them. Now that is an innocence that is not allowed to live. It must not exist. And so that's what black power does. Black consciousness rips the innocence of black people. Say, you cannot claim innocence in a situation where you are complicit because you accept your situation of oppression. But white people cannot claim innocence because you are above it all. And it's the job of black power to confront white people with that, what I call pseudo-innocence. And so that's how, and the whole book is an attempt to struggle with these realities and to help black people understand, and for those white people who wanted to read the book, also to see how we understood them to work. And so, in a sense, there's a critique of apartheid and the apartheid thinking in that book as well, and there's a critique of our own thinking, and there's an opening. The final chapter is about a black ethic toward the future, where I speak about how we can get this. And what I wanted to do was to see whether the things that I had written about in that book can be translated into sermons and into practice in the church and into practice in politics. And so my black consciousness, black theology, black power became a basis for me for political theory and for political practice. So I grew from that black consciousness and a black theology into a political engagement in the 1976 generation of uprising. And then in the early 1980s, we translated that into an even larger, more organized mobilization of the people that we called the United Democratic Front, which became the largest non-racial, non-violent movement in the history of our struggle. So, and it's not all because of me, but in terms of my own contribution to that, I felt like Albert Luthuli. What is my job? My job is to take my faith and my Christianity into the struggle with me in hopes that it would contribute to the good, the character of the resistance. And as long as I could do that, I could translate my faith into actual practice of political resistance. Because I also believed, and this is what black theology taught me, but also in a way, this is what my understanding of Calvin taught me, that if it is true, John Calvin said, that the Christian's responsibility is to make this world into the theater of God's glory, then that meant engagement in the political and social and economic issues of the world. That meant engagement into the situation of oppression. That means rising up against that which was evil and wrong and against God's will in our situation. And that means that my worship of God in the sanctuary on Sunday must be translated into my worship of God in the streets of protest between Sunday and Sunday. And so that for me, being a preacher and a worshiper on Sunday was continued in my work of protest and resistance on the streets, physically in confrontation with the forces of apartheid. That to me was worship. Well, in 1977, we formed within the Black Dutch Reformed churches a thing called the Circle of Brothers. I mentioned this to show you how unaware we were of our own sexism and patriarchalism. And it later changed when we became more sensitive and more aware and repentant of our old patriarchal ways. It later became the Confessing Circle. Now, in that circle, and it was a small group of preachers, ministers from the 3 Black Dutch Reformed churches. And there were some whites who had joined us. So the issues of can white and black really work together became an issue, and it was resolved, and we passed it. We knew, okay, we can aim and set our goals without regard to race if the commitment is clear and genuine. So we began to talk about apartheid and what it meant, and about unity of the churches, what that would mean, and things like that. And so those discussions developed. And in 1981, I then thought we should broaden this, because it's not just about the Dutch Reformed Church family. It's about all of us. And can I begin to bring the Reformed churches together? All the Reformed churches, the so-called mission churches, not the whites, but the ethnically divided Black Reformed churches in South Africa. And we issued an invitation, and they came together. And we formed an organization called the Alliance of Black Christians in Southern Africa, ABREXA. And at our first meeting, I did the keynote. And in that keynote, I spelled out my understanding of the Reformed tradition. I was very honest about how it is a tradition of oppression and exploitation in South Africa, how it is a tradition that has now enmeshed itself with a racist understanding, not just of the Reformed tradition, but of the Bible, the theology of apartheid as the heartbeat of all of that. And I asked the question, what does it mean for us, Black Reformed Christians? Can Black people ever be the spiritual children of John Calvin? And why would we, if this is what the Reformed tradition is in South Africa? The God of apartheid cannot be the God of oppressed Black people. That we knew. But how do we articulate that? And so what I did is the accumulation of my years of study, and that's how God's providence worked, that I ended up for my studies in the Netherlands, which is the mother of what's been happening here all the time. And I could have gone to Princeton, I could have gone somewhere else, but it worked out in the end, and I believe it's providential that I ended up in the Netherlands, in Kampen, and not at the Free University, where the weight of the Reformed tradition was felt more heavily even than at the Free. So my discovery of what I would call the other Calvin at first, and then connected that with what I learned from Paul Lehman in the United States. By the time I finished, I had a different understanding of Calvin, and I thought that this Reformed tradition in South Africa was a perversion. It was distorted. It was totally unacceptable to us. So if we decided that we want to be Reformed, it cannot be the Reformed of the white church. It has to be a totally new understanding of the Reformed tradition. And what I discovered to my joy is that Calvin had all of that for us. The Reformed tradition is not a tradition of oppression and racism. It's a tradition of liberation and of resistance against evil and oppression. It's a tradition not of an internal, inward-looking spirituality, a pietism that had nothing to do with the world. It's a world transforming and world formative faith is the Reformed faith. And John Calvin says to us, you go out there in the world, and whether it is in science or in arts or in this or in that or in politics, you go and you seek the glory of God and you seek the lordship of Christ. That's radical. That's radical. And the more I understood it, the more I loved it, and the more I thought, this is it. Not just for the struggle against apartheid, but for what I believe we are called to do in the world. And so I read John Calvin's Institutes, and there's lots of ambiguities there, but I came out in the end of it. And I also I learned to do what the French Huguenots do. When Calvin could not respond to their situation properly, for the Institutes, they looked, although you can see how by the time the French edition of the Institutes came out, there was already a discernible radicalization in Calvin's thought. It was much more critical of the monarchy. It was much more open about the embrace of resistance, all of that. I mean, the wonderful thing is to see the radicalization of Calvin, not just in the Institute, but more specifically in his sermons. And I read the commentaries. And in the commentaries, I read in the commentary on Matthew that God hates tyranny. And if you're not resisting tyranny, then you are hit by what you call a cowardice. You are like a donkey that bows to the pressure put on it, and and I thought, wow, if this is Calvin. I read his commentary on the Exodus and on the midwives, how he praised the midwives for their resistance to the Pharaoh, and how he says if there is how in Acts chapter 4, that famous verse of being more obedient to God than to human beings, how he says, no, these people have been put there by God and so forth, and they have the power of the office, authority, and so forth. But, he says, but the moment they overstep the line, the moment they oppress people, then it is as if they want to take God and draw God from God's throne. They challenge, he says, the rights of God. That's the first time I heard anybody ever say that God has rights. And if you are engaged in, and so he says, whatever they may be, you don't. That's what he ends the institutes with. So whatever power they have and whatever things they have, that's okay. But if they go against God, you utterly ignore them. By the time we get to the commentaries and the sermons, it's not just ignore them, it is resist them. Because there he says, because God has called for certain times, certain people to do something altogether new. And when I took that and placed it on the South African situation, it was like a light that went up for me. And that's when I discovered I have to be a liberation theologian, but to be a liberation theologian in the Reformed tradition with all that power that tradition gives, that's amazing. To me, it was irresistible. So what I did at that Abrexta conference is I explained all of that. In the question, the Reformed tradition, is it a challenge, a burden, or is it something else? So that is where I used for the first time the formulation that apartheid is evil, it's a heresy, it's a blasphemy. And Abrexa took that and put that together in a declaration, which we called the Abrexa Declaration. When the World Alliance of Reformed Churches was getting ready to meet in Ottawa in 1982, not this is 1981, when they were ready to meet in Ottawa in 1982 in August, they asked me to write a background paper on racism and the churches, because they had been trying to struggle with racism and the churches, and they never really got anywhere. They had some vague formulations, but they had last spoken about it in 1970 or something. And they were not very specific. And of course, the Dutch Reformed Church here and the Hervormde Kerk were still members of the World Alliance, merrily going on with their theology of apartheid and their segregation in the churches and so forth. And I then included the words that I used in that address at Abrexa. And then we met as Abrexa, and then I was invited as a speaker, as a Bible study leader. And so I decided in my Bible studies to raise the issue again. But we proposed from Abrexa to send a proposal. Now, this was not from an official church. This was a group of Christians from the Reformed churches. And I must say, I have always appreciated and admired the World Alliance of Reformed Churches for accepting a proposal from our side, which I then, of course, explained in my background paper, and I explained in my Bible study very clearly. And we said to them, this body must now say not just that apartheid is wrong, but it is a sin, it is a heresy, it is a blasphemy, it is a denial of what Christ had taught us. It's a denial of the gospel. Of course, that was controversial all by itself, but when we were in Ottawa, the black Christians came together, and then we heard, oh, there's going to be a communion service. Now, the communion service was on the Sunday before the General Council opened officially on the Monday. So we talked, and we said to each other, no, but this is not right. We were fighting the White Dutch Reformed Church at home, and we were very critical of their racist ideologies and practices. How can we now? And we were not allowed to have communion in their white churches with them. Why is it that when we come here abroad in the eyes of the whole world, that all of a sudden it's okay to sit down with white Dutch Reformed Church people and have communion as if that's nothing? Isn't that a form of judgment that Paul talks about, that we do over ourselves, that we eat and drink over ourselves if we do that? So we decided, no, we're not going to do that. But then, of course, you have to have a plan, and you can't just, and we said we can't just make a statement. You have to find a dramatic way of imprinting the reality of what we were talking about on the presence of the delegates. Otherwise, how would they understand? What I had written was words on paper. What I was going to say were words that they're going to hear. But what I had written on paper, they have already read. What I was going to say, they will hear. But how can we put what I had written and what I will say within a proper reality context? And that's when somebody came up with the idea, we've got to not take communion with the white church people here. And then we decided, well, if you're going to do it that drastically and you wanted to make an impact, you're not going to make an impact if you stay away from the service. You've got to make the impact in the service, and that's why we decided that we will stay in the service until communion, and then we will walk out. en masse, all of us. But then we must explain to them why we are walking out. So Jürgen Moltmann was the preacher. And I went to Jürgen Moltmann and I said to him, Dr. Moltmann, this is what we're going to do. So when we walk out, please don't think this is a reflection on your sermon. But we cannot think of any way to make clear to our brothers and sisters here what it means to live with a white racist church in South Africa. And we are not going to share communion with them here while they do not allow us to share communion with them at home. And he understood. So I said to him, so I will have to talk to the liturgist. And so I talked to the liturgist. And I said to him, we will raise our hands. And if you will please recognize us, we want to make a statement. So we asked one of our brothers, and he was not one of the radical brothers in our circle. And the white Dutch Reformed people of South Africa were totally caught off guard when he was the one who read the statement. But he went up, Edward Manikam, and he went up onto the pulpit. He read the statement, and after he read the statement, just before they served communion, we walked out. But I tell you, the shock of that moment brought home as nothing ever could. Because we said, God must forgive us if this is wrong, but we know of no other way. And so it went beyond the dramatic by then. By then it was a serious, genuine question, theologically for us. And that set the framework for the rest of the week. So by the time we got to the discussion of the proposal, the resolution that apartheid is a heresy and should be condemned as such, this is what was in the minds of those delegates. And in the debates, it really was only, as one could expect, the delegates from the White Dutch Reformed Church and the Hervormde Kerk who tried to defend and stand against it. But they lost completely. One of the brothers even made the mistake of referring to apartheid not only as a Christian solution, but as the final solution. Now, if you speak to a bunch of Europeans and you use the word final solution, that's the very phrase that Hitler and the Nazis used in regard to the Jewish issue, that was the final solution. So when he said final solution, it did two things. It showed the ideological connection in his mind. We had always said apartheid is like Nazism. And that made that connection. And the people from Europe, I remember a woman from Scotland, the Scottish Presbyterian Church, who got up and said, "What? Is this what it is for you?" So that made up her mind for her. And when she made the connection, everybody saw it. So it really went through without lots of debate, but without much resistance. And that is the single most important moment in the history of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches on the question of race, racism, and the gospel, and the integrity of the church. And that became the focal point. So in the ecumenical movement, that became the point of reference when churches were now talking about apartheid. And it represented a sea change in thinking about the connectivity between apartheid and oppression, and the connectivity between systems of exploitation and oppression, and subjugation and domination, and the use of the gospel, and the use of the Reformed tradition. So for people in the Reformed family who had always been embarrassed by apartheid and its theology and its claim that it was reformed, and they didn't know what to do about it, they could now say, "Oh, that's not the Reformed tradition, we know." And it's not we saying it, It's the black Reformed Christians. And they have decided to walk out of the church service, but not walk away from the Reformed tradition. We didn't walk away from the church. We invited them into a new understanding of church and to a new understanding of the Reformed tradition. That is why I say when black Christians from South Africa did that and reclaimed the Reformed tradition, it saved the Reformed tradition from perdition. And for me, that moment was a moment where I thought, well, where do we go from here with this tradition that was always weaponized against us? And now it is this door toward a newfound freedom and a newfound reclamation of the gospel that was so successful. I will never forget, I was in Chicago years later, and Martin Marty, that famous theologian from Chicago Divinity School, was in the audience, and we talked. And he said to me, in that August of 1982, he was here in South Africa, and he was with John de Gruchy on that day when the news came through. And he said to me, Allan, I will never forget what John said to me. John de Gruchy said to him, Marty, today the apartheid government just lost its legitimacy. They only don't know it yet. And that was the power of that resolution and the work of the World Alliance. Well, the Bellhour Confession, of course, was clearly a product of the transformation of theological thinking in the then Dutch Reformed Mission Church, the church that they set up for so-called colored people. Now, from its inception in 1881, up until really the Synod of 1978, that church was a so-called black church, but it spoke with a white voice. The power of the white Dutch Reformed Church over our church was clear. The power of the white missionaries in our church was clear. They had the voice. They had the privilege. We were only echoing what they wanted us to say. There was no real resistance. There was a bit of resistance in 1948 when the National Party came to power, and the white Dutch Reformed Church was so overjoyed, and it was actually the fruit of the work of the Dutch Reformed Church that brought that about. David Botha, who was a long-time minister in the Dutch Reformed Church, a missionary, was honest enough to say in his work that he had studied, he said that apartheid actually, officially as a state policy, was in fact the child of the missionary policy of the white Dutch Reformed Church began in 1857. And so as we were a child of that policy and the visible, solidified expression of apartheid in the churches, so that was taken into the state, and how hard the Dutch Reformed Church, the white church, had worked to get the National Party into power, to get certain laws done and they really dedicated themselves. And so that in September of 1948, when the National Party won, the Kerkbode, that's the official mouthpiece of the white Dutch Reformed Church, wrote that it was actually a victory for the church. Apartheid is a church policy, they said. And we must thank God that this has finally happened. So out of that controversy, there was a man called Reverend Isaac Morkel, who got so angry that he walked out of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church and formed a new denomination, today called the Calvin Protestant Church. And that's a history on its own. I don't want to say too much about that, but that was the split that we had gone. So, and between then, we had maybe 2 or 3 members of the clergy from our community in the Dutch Reformed Mission Church who raised their voices. And life was made so difficult for them that one was forced out of the church. He established sort of a lone standing independent congregation by himself. Never became a denomination like Isaac Morkel's. And then the other one was forced to flee the country, and he left and he went to Canada. So by the time we got to the 1970s, there was this subservient mass of people, a black church with a white voice, with no integrity, no credibility, no thinking of its own, no theology of its own, not daring to say anything about apartheid. In 1978, so that was the beginning of this new generation. Now remember, the Soweto uprising had been going on for 2 years. I had come back from the Netherlands with black theology and farewell to innocence. I had become the chaplain of students at the University of the Western Cape and the Cape Peninsula Technikon and the Belleville Teacher Training College, working with young people. Speaking all across the country. There was a new generation of young people, young theologians coming up. There was a new awareness amongst the colleagues. There was a new awareness in the community. Revolution was in the air. It was not yet as organized as it would be in the 1980s, but it was there. The church could not be unaffected. And for the first time, there came before us a set of resolutions about apartheid, which we worked on, and all of them, in one way or another, condemning apartheid, from the Mixed Marriages Act to all sorts of, or to detention without trial and things like that. And that synod took the time to take all those issues, not as a one report, but one by one by one by one. I was responsible for presenting that report, and I remember the moderator asking me, and I think he did that on purpose. I remember the moderator, who is David Botha, by the way, asking me, do you want to present the report as a whole, or do you want to take the points one by one? And of course, I said one by one. And so for hours, point after point after point after point, we mentioned, we put it before the Synod, we debated, and we took decisions. It was wonderful to see this church for the first time finding its voice. So that became the moment of decision and change and direction of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church. And so it became clear that our understanding of black liberation theology as a reformed theology does have impact on the thinking of people in the church. So by the time we got to 1982 was the next synod, we had even more radical things. And by that time, Ottawa had happened. And the heresy thing was on the table, and that decision was taken. And we also then took a decision that to do that, we need a new confession for the situation in which we find ourselves. Can we, as a Reformed church, formulate such a confession? So we talked about it. I was privileged to be one of the members of the committee who sat down, talked about it, and wrote the concept, which we brought back to that same synod 4 years later at the next synod, and after the churches and the presbyteries had opportunity to read it and to say yes or no, we brought it back to the synod and it was adopted. There were still some people, lots of missionaries in our churches, and some of our own clergy, black clergy in the church, who voted against it for all sorts of reasons. But the vast majority was for it. Now, Belgaar is important because it has three major pillars. One is unity, the next is reconciliation, the other one is justice. But it talks of unity as an obligation of the church in a way that the White Dutch Reformed Church never could and never wanted to. The White Dutch Reformed Church understanding of unity was always a spiritual unity. We are one in our diversity. but they almost in their taking of these gospel concepts and clothing it with apartheid and infusing it with apartheid, they made it toxic. So that for us in the church, it became a debate point whether we could use these gospel concepts like unity and good political concepts like diversity. Could we use that now that it was so poisoned by the White Dutch Reformed Church? And it was a debate, and we decided, no, these are concepts that do not belong to the white church. They belong to the gospel. And in that sense, they belong to the church as a whole. One of the things that struck me was that in the early days of colonization, when the Khoi first turned to Christianity, there was a Khoi evangelist, and I'm now not sure who it was, who said that the one thing that the Khoi Christians must get out of their minds is the idea that white people, because they are the masters in the situation, actually own the gospel. They don't own the gospel. Now I'm talking way back 1700 something. And so we use that argument. Doesn't matter how powerful you are and how much you abuse the gospel and use it for your own political expediency and racist ends, that's still the gospel. And it is possible for us to reclaim that. And so we use unity in that sense. Same is true for reconciliation. Now remember, this is 1986. It's in the middle of a state of emergency. I was in the chair. I asked people to raise their hands who had family members in detention. I asked them to raise their hands who had friends in detention. I asked to raise their hands who had people in their neighborhoods in detention. All their hands went up. So we talked about, is it possible? Now, that's 1985. This is the state of emergency. The United Democratic Front was established in 1983. The church was involved. I was deeply involved. And there were so many people who were in detention, who were tortured, who were shot at, who were all sorts of things. And so the question, how do you talk about reconciliation in a situation like that? Why do you want to be reconciled with these white people whose government, with their support and with their sanctification through their theology, kill your children? What does that mean? Unity with these people? Unity, reconciliation with these people? What do they even begin to understand about justice? So those were the issues. And we decided, no, but we will not let them dictate to us what the meaning of the gospel is for us. And we decided that the reconciliation they talked about is not the reconciliation we find in the gospel. It's different. It's fundamentally different. It's a counter movement to what they want. And when we talked about justice, one of the most wonderful things is that Article 4 that talks about God as the God of justice. And that the church should stand where God stands. And the justice is indivisible, meaning that the church is called to stand by people in any form of need, in any form of injustice, and to fight against any form of injustice wherever it may be found. To me, that's key, because that would lead to the future. And we then said two other things that are important in Belhar. We said the church as the possession of God. Now, in other confessional formulation in the church are those people called together by the saving grace of Jesus Christ and saved by his blood, and then so we come together and we form this community of faith. That's all fine. But what makes Belhar different is that we said the church is the possession of God. It's not owned by the powerful. It's not the possession of those who have dominion. It's not the possession of the wealthy. It's not the possession of the rich. It's not the possession of the loud mouths who scream at us and tell us what we are supposed to be. We are what God had made us to be. We are the possession of God. So we speak as a church that belongs to God. And linked to that is, we said, at the end of it, Jesus Lord. Now people hear that, and that is the first confession we read about in the New Testament that the church makes. Jesus is Lord. And they make that confession over against the claim of the Caesar that he is Lord, he is Savior of the world, he is the Prince of Peace, he is the bright morning star. And Jesus takes all those titles, turn it all around and says, does not belong to you, it belongs to me. That is an amazing thing, and that was the driving force of the resistance of the early Christian church in those first 3 centuries against the Roman Empire and against the ways of the Roman Empire and against the structures of the Roman Empire and against the rules of the Roman Empire, until the church began to give in because the church wanted to blend in and wanted to be accepted by the empire. But that's a different story. So for me, personally, Allan Boesak, that meant when the Minister of Justice, like he did in 1979, attacks the church and threatens the church because we have taken a decision that it is right for us. It's our Christian duty to engage in resistance and in civil disobedience. So, and the minister says, I tell you to keep your business to the gospel. And the church must do what the government says. No. You're not. We don't belong to you. You're not our God. We're talking Jesus here. Jesus is the Lord of the church. So that was my challenge to everybody, from Louis Lagrange, the letter that I wrote to Sleerbush, to Adrian Vlok, to P.W. Botha, to everybody. That was a mainstay. And if you think the church is the possession of God, that means, for me, it's a different understanding of what the Heidelberg Catechism says. Now, these days, nobody knows what that means almost anymore. But for me, that first question of Sunday 1, who do I belong to? And the answer is, no, I'm sorry, I put that wrong. What is your greatest comfort in life and in death? That's the question. That's the question, is who do I belong to? What is your greatest comfort in life and in death is the first question on the first Sunday. And the answer is that I, with body and soul, belong not to myself, but to my Lord and Savior, who is Jesus Christ. Now, I cannot begin to tell you how many times I have said that to myself. When I speak to people in moments of great exhilaration, when we know we need inspiration to go and fight because outside there's the police. We know there's going to be a confrontation. We know they're going to shoot. Some of us are going to go to prison. Some of us are going to die today. What is your comfort in that situation? And when they put me in prison and you are afraid, what are they going to do to me? Will they torture me? Will I be able to remain faithful? What if I die? That was my question. What is your comfort? The fact that they can do me nothing because I, in body and soul, in life and in death, belong to Jesus Christ. There is no tradition, I think, that articulates it in that way. And the inspiration is boundless. That is what Belhar has brought to the fore in that situation. By 1987, now before I say that, just remember where Belhar comes from. It's called the Confession of Belhar. Belhar is a so-called colored township in the Cape, on the Cape Flats. Those people who are there, who live there now, live there because of forced removals. They lost their homes because of the Group Areas Act. They lost their communities. Those communities were broken up. Their churches, like my church that I was baptized in and no longer exists because of Group Areas Act, and the church that I was ordained in no longer exists because of the Group Areas Act, bulldozed. And the ground where we stood on now belongs to some supermarket owned by a white person. And those people were uprooted from places where they had stayed for centuries almost. And they were discarded people. This is a community that was made powerless and voiceless by apartheid. And here they come and they formulate a confession that speaks with a power that obliterates the dominion of the White Dutch Reformed Church. They speak with a power that opens up to the world, so that today, across the world in Reformed churches, they have adopted, accepted Belhar. I come to Palestine, I hear how Belhar has inspired them. I meet a young man from Korea who wrote a song on Belhar in Korean. Go figure that. And I think they know what binds us together. So culture and language and situation, they don't matter, because the unity in Christ that Belhar speaks of is there, only in a different way. And what does it matter that the White Dutch Reformed Church even today rejects Belhar and rejects unity and rejects reconciliation? What does it matter? It matters in some way, but in a real sense, our unity with other communities of faith, genuine across the world, matters more to me. And so that's what Belhar did. By the time, there's between 1982, when we first wrote the draft of the confession, and by 1986, when we adopted it, there was the first state of emergency. The second state of emergency was declared in 1986. By 1987, we had 40,000 people in detention without trial across the country. 40% of them children under 18 years old. By that time, I had gone from funeral to funeral to funeral, week after week after week. I had buried people who were tortured by the security police with a blow torch by the time our synod met. I had spoken to parents in Lingelishle in Uitenhage in the Eastern Cape. I preached at the funeral where we buried 27 people at one time. I counted those coffins. The police, in reality, killed 42, but refused to release the rest of the bodies. And so they gave only 27. You come with all those experiences. Abi Visagi was one of our ministers in Middelburg, in the Cape, now in the Eastern Cape. And Abi was tortured. His health was permanently damaged. He's in a wheelchair today. When we voted for unity and for reconciliation and for justice, he raised his hand. He said yes. That's the Spirit of God. So Belhar, the white church, has no idea what it's doing in rejecting Belhar. And they will live to see the judgment of God on a church that rejects unity and reconciliation and justice in the way that it has been offered them. And they still do not want to. So Belhar is a judgment on the white Dutch Reformed Church, but now we find, and that is the nature of a genuine confession. Jaap Durand was a white minister from the Dutch Reformed Church and a professor at our theological seminary. And one of those, like Beyers Naudé, who had, I always say, taken upon himself the condition of blackness as black consciousness defined it. And so he stood on our side in all of this. When we adopted the confession, he wrote an article in which he says, we will see whether the Dutch Reformed Mission Church can stand up to the challenge that its own confession will pose to it. And lo and behold, in this South Africa now, the challenge is not racial justice, although racism still exists, but the major challenge is the question of gender justice and equity of women, and an even stronger challenge is the dignity and justice for LGBTQI persons. My understanding of Belhar is that if in Belhar we confess that God's justice is indivisible and that God's justice is all-inclusive, and that God is a God who stands by people in any form of injustice, and we must fight that injustice if we stand next to God. That's where God wants us to stand. If that is true for us when we fought apartheid and racial justice was the issue, that must be true today for LGBTQI people. It's the same God. It's the same demand. It's the same church. It's the same obligation. How dare we claim God to be on our side in the question of racial justice, but we deny God's justice for LGBTQI people because of our prejudice, our bigotry, our hypocrisy, and our homophobia. That's my present tension with my church on this question, and it's not yet resolved. One of the things we learn from Calvin is that whenever we speak of these things, we must speak of the woundedness of God. Calvin says, every injustice in any form inflicted upon any of God's children, is a wound inflicted on God's self. Therefore, healing the wounds of those wronged and despised and discriminated against and marginalized and excluded and beaten up, healing their wounds is in effect, is my conclusion, healing God's wounds. It's a thought that I still cannot wrap my mind totally around, but it's amazing. If I do justice to you when you have been done an injustice to, I am not only healing you, I'm healing God. Can you get that? And so that's John Calvin. That's how radical Calvin is. Calvin says, when the oppressed cry out, "How long, Lord, how long?" then it is in effect, he says, as if God hears God's self when they cry. So God places God's self in the place of the poor and the oppressed. When they cry, it's God's voice you are hearing. If you are reformed, and you believe Calvin is right, how can you not do justice? So for me, when I talk of hope, I do not want us to talk of hope because we are like that, like Christians talk about reconciliation. It's an airy, fairy, pietistic thing, and we feel good about ourselves. Oh, hope is this, and hope that, and hope that. And so I have a friend in the United States. He's Hispanic. His name is Miguel de la Torre. Miguel de la Torre works what he now calls with an ethic of hopelessness. Miguel says, this thing about hope, we must throw that away because it paralyzes people. It makes people complacent. It makes people think, oh, that's okay, but we have hope. Oh, this is terrible, but we have hope. And he says, when you're done with your sermons about hope and your pious talk about hope, then that person or those people are still in the same position. They're still being hurt. They're still being despised. They're still being done injustice to. They're still being oppressed. They're still being exploited. So just shut up about hope. But if you have an ethic of hopelessness, that is a driving force to change the situation in which you are. I have the exact opposite thing. I think that a hope that is anchored to the rebelliousness of Christ and a hope that is anchored to the woundedness of people, that has the inspirational effect that propels us towards action to do what is right and to make justice a reality. Not hopelessness. Hopelessness makes me give up, but having that reality-based and rootedness, hope, because it is sentimentality when you talk about hope and you do not see or talk about or recognize the woundedness of people. So that's where you begin. And that places your hope in context. And that places a break on self-satisfaction and on complacency and on hypocrisy and on self-gratification. Because it's not about you. It's not about you. It's about the wound of those people who are struck by the injustice I condone, and especially that I benefit from. That's the wounds. And not about their wounds only. It's about the woundedness of God that we're talking. So that is a whole different category of thinking. And the second thing is that hope for me is rooted in the resurrection. Because the resurrection in the New Testament is apanastasia. That's the Greek word for rebellion. So for me, the resurrection is God's rebellion. Christ is risen from the dead because that's part of God's rebellion against the domination of evil and death. It nullifies death. It's rebellion. And God says, I raised Christ from the dead to rebel against the domination of evil in the world. So I destroy the works of Satan by the resurrection. And what the resurrection says to us, with that message that Jesus tells the women and the men are too stupid and too patriarchal and too dumb-headed to know what he's talking about or what they are talking about, is that Christ says, come and join me in my revolution. When you say the risen Christ, you say the revolutionary Christ. You say the Christ who is in rebellion, and that's where I belong. If I believe in the resurrection, that is where I must be, joining God in God's rebellion against all that is evil and wrong and dehumanizing in the world, trying to deprive God of God's rights. And God has a right to give us freedom and joy. And God has a right to call us to be God's children. God has a right to establish justice in all the earth, Isaiah says. God has a right to let the poor hear the good news. God has a right to set the captives free. God has a right to set liberation to those who are oppressed. God has a right to heal the brokenhearted. And that's the rebellion I join. to make sure that God's rights are expected, received, and embraced in this world. And that's what I learned from John Calvin. So that's what hope means for me. So it's woundedness and it's rebellion. If it is one without the other, it doesn't work. If it has neither, you might as well keep quiet.